foregone revenues as a result of not proceeding with major oil and gas production and transmission facilities has been astounding. I mean, I don't have a ready number to give you, but almost every one of those pipeline projects would have involved somewhere between 10 and 12 billion dollars in investment during the construction stage, and of course billions of dollars in income that would accrue every year that they were operating. The oil sands projects were as large or larger. The absence of the pipeline capacity has also had adverse impacts on producers, because with limited physical access to export markets, Canadian heavy oil producers have found that their oil in the mid-continent area must sell at a discount. And from 2010 to 2018, the results of that discount was a loss of about $40 billion for Alberta producers. People don't realize about the oil and gas industry is what an enormous supplier of revenues to governments that it is. In the early part of the decade, from 2010 to about 2015, the oil and gas industry was providing about $15 to $18 billion a year in revenues to federal and provincial governments as a result of income taxes and royalties. As a result of the significant decline in international oil prices and other factors, the amount of income generated by the industry for governments declined to about $10 billion per year. But that still represented about 6% of the total revenue that goes to governments. That's an absolutely critical amount of money to pay for all of the services that consumers need, not just consumers. I mean, let's put it this way: if that $10 billion was a year in revenues was lost to the federal government, they would have to recoup that elsewhere. Even in a current environment in which governments are constantly inclined to go into debt rather than raise taxes, that cannot go on indefinitely. At some point, governments have to start having sufficient revenue raised through income taxes, personal taxes, corporate taxes, personal taxes, excise taxes, etc., so that it meets the majority of the revenue needs that we need to operate the country. And as things stand now, the role played by the oil and gas industry in providing that support for our standard of living is constantly declining. There probably is no greater myth than the myth that the oil and gas industry is a major recipient of government subsidies. For many years, the oil and gas industry, and particularly the oil sands industry, was the beneficiary of, and it was called the accelerated capital cost allowance, which was a tax benefit that the industry could receive if it invested in exploration and development. Basically what it involved was a tax deferral. So instead of having to pay tax on one depreciation rate, you paid it on a lower depreciation rate in the early years, but you had to pay more tax in the later years. So it was a deferral of taxes, not a reduction of taxes. It only gained a sense of value because of the time value of money. But the government has phased that out entirely. It started phasing it out about 2010, significantly reduced it in 2013, and it was completely eliminated by 2016. So I did an assessment looking at the records that Finance Canada publishes every year of how much money is currently being provided to the Canadian oil and gas industry as a result of other remaining tax incentives, if you will. The figure is now $8 million a year. Okay, $8 million in taxes versus from an industry that pays $10 billion per year. Compare that to the renewables industries. And that's a whole other story. I have done a number of articles that have attempted to come to an appreciation of the value of the subsidies and other market advantages that are provided by governments to wind and solar and biomass. There are 24 generic different types of such subsidies and market advantages. No one has ever done a systematic evaluation of the value of those subsidies, but they're immense. Some studies have been done in the United States, and in the United States, over the period of the past decade, solar energy received about $3.6 billion a year in federal government subsidies, and wind received about the same as well. The comparable figures for oil and gas were a tiny fraction of that. And that gets no public attention from the media at all. And of course, the renewables industry is certainly not going to mention it. And whereas the oil and gas industry pays, as I say, in Canada, $10 billion a year. There are no figures on the amounts that the United States oil and gas industry pays, but it must be, very large as well. There are no data available on the income taxes that are paid by the wind and solar and biomass industries. My personal guess, because they have, as I say, 24 different types of subsidies and market event, they're paying very little, if any, income tax. So it's all one-sided in terms of the fiscal relationship between the government and these different energy industries. Well, the National Energy Board was formed in 1959, and I'm not familiar with all of its operations since that point in time. To my knowledge and recollection, they did turn down some pipeline projects in the early years of operation. But if you will, the industry learned that there were certain fairly high standards that they had to meet if they were going to get their project approved. And so they usually did their homework. And so they would come prepared to answer all of the questions that the NEB professional staff had. And as time went on, and more interveners were involved in the proceedings that were opponents of the projects, the types of questions and standards that they had to meet were becoming increasingly more and more strenuous. Over time, the National Energy Board's review process led to a situation in which, yes, they were approving the projects, but they were attaching conditions to it of all kinds. I mean, they would attach conditions with respect to financial matters, they would with respect to engineering questions, with respect to environmental issues, with respect to social benefits, with respect increasingly to the consultations with Aboriginal peoples. And so, yes, there was approval, but you'd have to call it approval with conditions, extremely strenuous conditions. And those conditions were ones that industry became familiar with. It added to the costs, certainly, of the constructing the projects, but it became part of the way that the whole system operated. And increasingly, the number of conditions that they applied had to do not only with the construction phase, but with the way in which a company had to operate its facilities over the life of the project, and the way in which they would ultimately dispose of the assets at the end of its useful life. So it's not as though the National Energy Board was kind of being lax in any way in terms of the standards that they were requiring. They were well regarded in the world as one of the best regulatory bodies in the world dealing with energy infrastructure.